Good afternoon. He said, I'm Mark Mitchell, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense. I serve as the Secretary Mattis's Principal Staff Advisor for a variety of topics: special operations, irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, stability and humanitarian operations, stabilization, detainee policy. So we've been known as the junk drawer of OSD policy. I want to just quickly say thanks to Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Fernandez for some pretty amazing conversation and discussion. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be either as erudite or as fascinating as them. So good thing we got off to a good start. I want to say thanks to General Howell and General Thomas, Joe Miller, and the rest of the SOCOM staff for their efforts putting this all together. And thank you to my fellow panelists and everybody else, all the rest of the participants, for taking time out of your day to join us. I think this is a very important discussion that we're having. So I want to talk just for a few minutes, very briefly, about my perspectives where I sit at the Pentagon and some of the challenges that we see, our approaches and our challenges to building and sustaining these partnerships. Obviously, you wouldn't be here if we didn't have work with a variety of partners to try and ensure that these terrorist groups don't have the safe havens and can't disrupt our respective societies. From intelligence exchanges to equipping, training, mentoring, and all the way to combined operations against these common enemies, we employ a whole variety of approaches, both here at home and overseas. And in a lot of these cases, the pre-existing regional structures, whether it's AMISOM or NATO or some other regional organization, can form the basis of it. Or we have a lot of bilateral counterterrorism efforts, or ad hoc coalitions, as we see in the international coalition to defeat the Islamic State. We put a lot of emphasis, frankly, and sometimes in my personal opinion, too much emphasis on the tactical piece, the actual, the end state, the door kicking, and arresting or killing suspected terrorists. What I would like to see, my personal approach, is a more holistic and multi-echelon approach to these extremists. And I think this is what our panelists will get at. It's not just the military dimension. There's a whole lot more that goes into the counterterrorism capability. And I've talked about this in the Army a lot and in the Department of Defense. I see it as a pyramid, and the military tactical piece is just the very top portion of that. And the foundation really is a legal approach, because for most of the people here, terrorism is a domestic problem. We in the United States see it a lot as a expeditionary problem, but from the position of our partners and allies, whether in Iraq or other countries, the Philippines, it's a domestic problem for them, and they have to base their approach on their domestic legal basis. So that causes some challenges for us, because it's not, the legal systems are often quite different and not compatible. We see these different foundations. Sometimes DoD, we're not the most appropriate partner in these cases for the approach to terrorism, particularly if some of the local efforts are led by police forces. There's also differing levels of institutional capacity, frankly, and the ability to sustain the force and the capabilities they bring, and really the political will that goes with it. It varies from country to country. And often the countries where the terrorist threat is the greatest is where there is the most significant amount of political disputes within those countries. There's also different perspectives on human rights, which can really complicate our efforts to work with and support partners. There's also great disparities in the ability to collect, process, disseminate, fuse and disseminate intelligence between partners. Often, sometimes within the same country, our varying partners may be hesitant to share intelligence with their fellow citizens. And lastly, there's often there's a tendency in some countries to misuse the capabilities that we create, particularly special operations forces. So we require a lot of flexible and adaptable tools. Beyond Iraq, Afghanistan, and the other areas of conflict, we need to get out ahead of these of the terrorists and apply those tools in other contexts. So we need to think about counterterrorism fight as more than, again, just the kicking doors. We need to think about how do we counter weaponized information and propaganda, something I think that, again, the panel will get to. And we also really need to think about sovereignty and stabilization, post-conflict stabilization, and what does that do? I own that for the Department of Defense, and frankly, we don't really even have authorization to do that ourselves. We offer support to stabilization, but I think it's a critical question in these areas when we look, again, particularly in Iraq and Syria, but also Afghanistan, finding a long-term political situation to the problems. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to each of my panelists, starting with Mr. Barabandi, and then going down the line to give some comments.
Thank you. So shall I sit here? Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for SOCOM. As a Syrian, first I would thank you very much for everybody who's here. I would like to thank the SOCOM, the whole SOCOM, with the great job they are doing in Syria to fight ISIS, that liberate all Syrian from that terrorist group. Here I've tried to address the whole issue of ISIS or the extremism group from many different angles based on person who live in that area, learned that area, lived all my life in that area. I think we have major big problem of our ID. I will build up where Dr. Bill, he left about the ID and the conflict of the IDs and the history of that. It is very important to understand it to defeat ISIS or defeat any extremist group. It may show up later in the future. The Arab world, especially the Levant, they have been under the Ottoman Empire for 100 years. So the idea, it was a little bit solved. We are Sunni under Ottoman Empire, and that's fine. And the problem started when the empire was defeated by the Arabs, by the British. And then we start to ask who we are. Are we Arabs? Are we Muslims? Are we Bedouin? Are we who we are? And then there's so many school of thought that goes up from the day after to answer that questions. Some people, they say we are more Muslim than Arabs, and they affected by their ideas and developed to be Muslim Brotherhood. There's some people to say, no, we are Arabs before we became Muslims, and mainly the Christian who say the Arabic is the most important than the religion. The Arabic language, the Arabic history is before the Islamic religion. And then we have till today the fight between secularism and Islamism that we didn't find till now the real answer of it that identify who we are in that area. What makes things worse, after the Ottoman Empire, that we have the British and the British Mandate who try to shape that's new societies and give them more new ideas and values like education. At that time, the society was rejecting all the Western value because, as they said before, it's imperialism, it's occupation. Why to accept the education? Why to accept a lot of values that is, even it come by mandate or by foreign forces, but it wasn't that bad. When we liberated from our countries, from the British and the French, we have third category of instability, which is the authoritarian regime. We have Abdel Nasser in Egypt who said, we are Arabism, and everybody should be Arabism, and affect all our knowledge that we are Arabism. At the same time, then we have the Baathism to say we are not Arabism, like Syria and Libya we have. And all these models of the regimes that came to the Arab world from after collapsing of Ottoman Empire till today, they didn't give to the Arab people the stability, the structure, the government, the institution that represent the people. It was like just a fluid institution. When Gaddafi fell down, Libya collapsed. That means there's no institution, there's no rule of law. There is no any institution that works based on its national agenda, rather than institution that build on serving the leader. We have this in Syria, we have this in Iraq, we have this in Yemen as well. Among all this, the extremism can come up. It's very easy to sell themselves. We are the alternative. We have something very easy to sell. We are Muslims. We have very easy to sell. We are more tolerant toward others. We will get you the Sunni rights. There will be more distribution of wealth. They promise so many things. The normal people, they didn't get it through the institutionalizing governments. I think that's the trick that happens especially with ISIS. What adds more to it, that the United States in general, they have very big experience in countering other countries, like Russian, the Soviet Russian. You have huge experience how to deal country to country, maybe Afghanistan, not Afghanistan, maybe Korea, maybe other things. It's easy for United States establishment to think where the weak point for other nation as a country. When United States or the counter-ISIS coalitions, they are acting against non-state actor. And through the history, you were failed big time. You try to impose your own way of fighting on small non-state actors like Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Israelis tried to defeat Hezbollah in Lebanon, actor and non-actor. They failed big time. You try to do this in Taliban. You spend billions of dollars. Still you are spending billions of dollars. Now we are trying to do the same, countering ISIS in Syria, state to non-state. Our vision, and now we're back to Syria, our vision on ISIS, the more the counter-coalition or counter-ISIS coalition count on the locals, support them, empower them, give them what the national state couldn't do, and give them what ISIS failing or bluffing them to do, I think then we have stability. We cannot say today Syria as one unified Syria. We don't say whenever the regime enter any area, the people will flee. Even in Deir ez-Zor, can you imagine Deir ez-Zor with all the heading, all the shelling that happens in the city of Deir ez-Zor? The civilian, they ran away to Daesh area. They didn't go to the regime area or to the Kurds area, SDF. They don't trust the regime. The idea behind it that the natural allies for countering any extremism is the locals. The more you empower the locals, the more you listen to the locals, give them the guarantees they are looking for, give them the stability they are looking for, your fight will be much cheaper, smaller, easier, and successful for everyone. The more you try to go by yourself to do it, I don't see how it looks like. Today we have Deir ez-Zor. I tell you something about how ISIS work in Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor is a very poor area. It's in the desert. It has a border with Iraq. The population around 1.something million, 1.1 before the war. After the war, before of the destruction, barrel bombs and the regime, the number reduced to the half. When ISIS went into the city had around 63 oil and gas wells. 4 are major. They're supporting all Syria by oil and gas. What they did, they distribute the other 60 or 95 oil fields to the tribes in every city. And they told them, you are in charge of this oil. You take it, you distribute it among the families, and we as an ISIS, we take 60 to 70% revenue, but the 30% is for you. So today, or till short time from now, most of the tribes, they were affiliated economically with ISIS. And they say, okay, the regime will come back, they will take all the oil. That is the case has been for the last 60 years. They never used the oil for benefit of the people, they just corrupted. The Kurds will come and the people say, okay, the SDF, they did great job to defeating ISIS, but at the end of the day, they want their own state. They don't want the Syrian state. They will make the Arabs to leave. And the worst scenario that we have, Iranians are coming. And this is the real challenge for everybody. Iranian, they need the land, they don't need us. That's why we have a huge immigration movement. Today it's clear for us that all the Syrian immigration, it was very systematic from the Iranian, because Iranian, they cannot control Syria with 7 or 22 million. So the easy thing to bomb everything, push them up, and now Iranian is in control. And everybody looking now, if the Iranian take the oil in Deir ez-Zor, they don't need the reconstruction money from the World Bank. Syria is distracted, they need just $100, $200 million from local money to empower themselves inside Syria, empower the militia they have inside Syria. US is doing a great job defeating ISIS and al-Nusra, and they will leave, then the locals will stay alone. The big challenge we are having today as a Syrian, dealing with the Pentagon and other guys, to say, You have natural allies who is Sunni, who belong to that part, who want to defend, to liberate his land from ISIS. These people are looking for United States help. The question will be, will United States committed 2 years from now after the fight or no? So from the military side, as Mark said, they cannot give commitment for 2 years or 1 year as stabilization. The area is rich. You don't need money. We need security and stability, and the money will come later. But politically, they say it's big pictures. We have to talk with the Russians. We have to talk with Turkey. We have to do a lot of things. Militarily, they say we are willing to work with the locals on tactical level. 6 months, 4 months, 8 months, whenever the mission will finish, and then we are leaving. All this will allow ISIS to come back. This is the key word. Defeating ISIS doesn't mean, definition of defeating ISIS for us is not to defeat ISIS physically the way you did in Raqqa. You just destroyed Raqqa city. As it is, it has been destroyed. That doesn't help generally. Defeating ISIS means ISIS should not come back after 2 or 3 months from now, the way it happens before in Anbar. So we need to work with the locals to close all the loopholes that the people have in order not to be used again by extremism or extremist group like ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra. We don't know what the third part or how this evolve will be. The ISIS now, they run away from the main cities in Mosul, in Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa, and they will go to the desert. It's a huge area, empty area that nobody can control. We believe they have the resources. They are watching how politically things is moving around. Will the Kurds take the cities, Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa? That will be best ingredient for ISIS to come back. To say, you know what, we are Sunni, you kick out by the Kurds by help of United States. So all these are enemies. Let's go fight back. When we talk the regime or Russian or Iranian come to that area, that will be much more worse. It become more sectarian, Sunni, Shia, Alawite, Sunni. This is the best ingredients to ISIS to come back in a new shape that we don't know how it looks like, but we know it. We know where are they, who are they. The easiest solution is, even its controversial solution, that United States should work with the locals, empower the locals. You have the experience working with the Iraqi Awakenesses movement. It works, but the shortage of commitment, it collapsed. Now we have big enemy on the ground. It's Iranian, it's Russian, it's the regime, it's ISIS. If you leave, one of these four will fill the gaps, and the question will be, does it worth for the United States to spend $10 billion on that fight, then the Russian take and win it? All the world look at the perception, and the Middle East, our countries, we believe in conspiracy theory. It's in our DNA. There's no way to say that people here, they don't care. Nobody buys it. In our part of the world, they believe that the United States knows everything and they can change everything but just by signature of the president. They don't see it that there's institution or there's different priority and there's different way of looking into the issues. Again, this kind of things, it's empower more extremism who have no hope in life because of the government, because of education, because of unequal distribution of wealth. To take over. I give you one example in Syria, in Damascus. In Damascus in 2011, before the revolution started, we have 2 theaters, 2 movie theaters, and 1 theater to play theater, and we have more than 600 mosques. And then the regime say, I'm secular. And then the regime say to the media, why all these revolutionary guys, they went from the mosque? Why didn't go from any other places? Which makes sense for you as a Western to say, that's a good idea, man. But why these people didn't go from other place? Because there's no other place except the mosque. All these regimes, they work on the fear, your fear as a Western, from extremism, from terrorists, and they manipulate it, they empower it, they sell it back to you, and they sell them back as they are solving the problems. And we go in that circle again and again and again. I don't know if I have to talk more. No. I can talk more. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kimmich.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back at Sovereign Challenge. I'm Daniel Kimmich. I'm the acting coordinator of the State Department's Global Engagement Center. For those who aren't familiar, the Global Engagement Center was set up last year by an executive order, but it grew out of an earlier project that was called the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication. That project and the first version of the Global Engagement Center were entirely focused on countering terrorist propaganda. Today, our center has a much broader mission. In the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress gave us a new mission, which is to lead, synchronize, and coordinate all of the U.S. government's efforts aimed to counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation. So this is a very broad mission. We're still primarily focused on the counterterrorism mission, but our mission is growing. I have been involved in this work in a variety of forms for most of my career. I lived in Russia for 5 years in the late 1990s, and I did historical research. When I came to Washington, I began working at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I wrote about Russian business, I analyzed Central Asian politics, and then I began doing reports on how al-Qaeda was using the internet, how Iraqi insurgent groups were using the internet. That eventually led me to the State Department, where I helped to stand up the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and now I'm back at the Global Engagement Center. Propaganda and disinformation are nothing new, but today we face, I would say, unusually challenging circumstances. First, we're in an era of much greater geopolitical complexity than most of us have seen for decades. Second, with the return of geopolitics, we are also seeing the return of ideology, not just al-Qaeda ideology, ISIS ideology. Our own societies are full of debates, polarization. We're seeing the rise of right-wing politics in Europe. We're in an era where the great debates are not behind us. We are in the middle of great debates. And then third, and in some ways maybe the most important factor, technology. And the same technology that has put the encyclopedia in the hands of any single person with an internet connection has also put a multimedia storyteller in everybody's pocket. And it is not always clear who is telling the story and who controls that narrative. So, what are we going to do about it? At the Global Engagement Center, we have two main goals. So, the first one is to better understand where we can help to coordinate the work that all of us in this room are doing. This means not only all of the various agencies within the U.S. government, but also the partner governments, many of which are represented here, non-governmental organizations, and civil society groups working on the ground, the locals that my colleague just mentioned. We understand that the people in the groups that are closest to the battlefield of narratives, the ones who are most affected by propaganda and disinformation, they are the most effective in countering them. And it's our mission to work as closely as possible with them as we move forward. Our second main goal is to use the technology that is already widely available in the private sector. Terrorist groups and authoritarian regimes do not need to be the only innovators. We also can innovate. Now, this could mean that we leverage online data analytics to measure how content is received by various audiences, or we can buy the same kind of targeted advertising that others have tried to leverage against us. But the point is, we always need to be looking for new ways to gain an edge, just as we see terrorist groups do every day. We need to be the ones they are reacting to, as opposed to be us reacting to them. So in terms of working more closely with other governments, one of our major lines of effort has been working with the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS. And we've worked on a unified coalition messaging and counter-messaging effort to oppose ISIS's narrative. This has a number of components. One is to undermine the appeal of ISIS's ideology. The second, and in some ways I would say the most important, is to amplify the voices that are coming from the region that are undermining, countering and disputing that ideology. And thirdly, supporting those in the region who seek a moderate and modern future. The coalition's counter-messaging efforts, which are co-led by the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, and the U.S., draw on the expertise of the Global Engagement Center, as well as the United Arab Emirates' own Sawab Center. This messaging was very active during the liberation of Mosul, as well as during the ongoing fight to complete the retaking of Raqqa. Recently, these efforts highlight stabilization projects from across the coalition, along with stories from survivors about how they are rebuilding their lives. We aim to continue the Global Coalition's messaging campaign as we squeeze ISIS out of the Middle Euphrates River Valley and put pressure on them throughout the world. Ultimately, the coalition is committed to exposing the falsehoods that lie at the heart of ISIS's ideology and present a positive alternative for the region. And let me close by saying that this is work that we cannot do on our own. I take very much to heart the comment that we cannot do this in isolation, and it's very heartening to see represented in this room many of our close partners, and I look forward to answering your questions and, of course, to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
So, Admiral Mitch Bradley, I'm the new director of the Trans-Regional Threats Coordination Cell, which is a subdivision of the Joint Staff's J5. J5 classically does sort of strategy and policy for the Joint Staff, for now Chairman Dunford, and T2C2's placement within that is a recognition of one of our core functions, which is really helping to develop DoD strategy, uniform military strategy to get after that problem. It emerged several years ago when then Chairman Dempsey began to recognize the need that everybody has talked about here, which is that the solution to these problems we face today are not just military. In fact, the long-term solution are really everything other than military. It's the military application of power and violence that is only to create a foothold whereby those other elements of national power and whole of government and really whole of coalition power can be brought to bear. So T2C2 was created to help organize across the Joint Staff our various actions and support to those other efforts. So as such, we take on a myriad of those activities and represent the Joint Staff in the National Security Council's deliberations to that extent. But we also do a couple of other things that are unique and I think are really the hallmarks of what has changed about our U.S. government approach to this problem, in particular our DoD approach to the problem of ISIS or violent extremist organizations writ large. And that is a recognition that this solution, the only solution, has got to be both whole of government and global. It's got to be a coalition perspective. It's got to be a coalition approach. T2C2, then, we are the managers of the U.S. DoD relationships with the coalition members within the global coalition to defeat ISIS. We do that through managing and maintaining relationships with our partners that are out there and helping to create unity of effort across the militaries to help us all contribute and give support to the efforts that are important. Chairman Dunford talks about that strategic design or that approach really through about 5 different ways or 5 different activities. And you'll recognize these in many of the things that my colleagues here have talked about. First, of course, there is a violent problem out there, and in some cases violence is required to counter it. And so the use of military power and law enforcement efforts to decisively interdict those threats as they come to our homelands or they threaten our interests abroad is a key tenet of what the militaries across the world bring to the fight. But most importantly are then looking beyond that at how we go at the trans-regional network enablers that our enemies use, whether it's the ideology, the messaging they use to recruit and to radicalize and then to bring those recruits forward to employ. Whether it's going after the finances that they use to empower and energize their operations, or whether it's the real commodity that is the most dangerous, and that's the people themselves who are trafficked throughout the world to be brought to the battlegrounds or to be brought to new battlegrounds, and how we prevent those 3 primary network enablers from being brought together at any particular time. The other effort that is kind of classically not military that we support is what we call counter-violent extremism, which gets to everything that everyone has talked about here. It's the underpinnings of societal issues that have brought about the conditions whereby folks can be radicalized and can be recruited and brought to the table, or brought to the battleground, as it were. And then finally, it's deliberately going after the messaging that is involved and that's used as such a tool. And so those sort of principal lines of effort, if you will, or those functions are the ways in which we organize Department of Defense's activities against the enemy. Chairman Dunford also kind of charters us with trying to unify across, or being the military portion, to unify across the U.S. government interagency. And so we have a large amount of interaction with our colleagues in the other departments and agencies in the U.S. government to synergize and bring that action together, and then to try to pull out best lessons learned that we can translate to our partners across the globe in the broader coalition. So that's what Trans-Regional Threats Coordination Cell does. It's a mouthful when you say it all out like that. T2C2, as we're more affectionately known inside the building. And with that, I look forward to questions, and thanks for being here.
Great. So I'm going to, as the moderator, I reserve the right to ask the first questions for each of our guests. So, and once I get done with my questions, we'll broaden it out to the rest of the audience. So the first question is for Mr. Barabandi.
That's Mark.
You spoke about the local approach and building security in cities such as Dar es Salaam and Raqqa. But beyond that, we still have the challenge of building collective security in a broader society in the aftermath of the war, assuming at some point that there is either a partition of Syria or some sort of unification. But from your vantage point, what are the obstacles now to improving or to building civil society structures and delivering humanitarian relief in Syria? And what can the U.S. government and partner governments do better to coordinate and synergize this effort?
Yeah, it's very important questions that nobody have an answer to it, frankly. But I know from our experience on the ground, we do monitoring and evaluation for USAID projects on Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen. So we have some common trend among all of this. And I'll talk specifically now on Syria. In Syria, the regime tried to project himself that the only body can hold on Syria. So all the local councils that exist to defend the regime, to run the liberated area at a certain time, which get a big finance and support from US government, USAID projects, the regime tried to destroy it. And the big example we have it last 2 days before in Idlib, when the Russian, under claiming that they want to destroy al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra group in Idlib, they destroy all the hospitals. And we talked to everybody to say, guys, even today, I mean, we were some Russian guys here in DC to say, we agree with you that Jabhat al-Nusra is terrorists, why don't you destroy them? What to do with the school, ambulances, and this kind of stuff? So the regime and Russian and Iranian, they don't believe in what's called civil society. They don't believe in something called the people can control themselves, even in local scale, like a small village, like Daraya, like any city in Syria, small city. They bomb it purposely. This is the big challenges. So from an international perspective, international donors, I think they did a lot for building Syrian civil society, especially in Syria, by the school, hospital, medical aid, you name it. The other side makes sure to destroy everything the other side is doing. And we try, even last year we met with Secretary Kerry more than 3 times, and we show him where his money is going as US money and what the Russians are doing with this money. So they build a school, they destroy the school. You build hospital, they destroy hospital. You train the people, they kill the people. So the day after, let's go to day after. I think the day after should be, number one, there should be national ceasefire in Syria. What Russia called de-escalating zone, they call de-escalating. That means they still can go and kill. We are calling for ceasefire all over Syria. Give the Syrian people the right just not to be killed, just to survive for 6 months without being killed. The civil society by itself will grow up. They have to fill the gaps on the society, and then that will develop little by little. If we talk political solution in Syria, how it will solve the Syrian problem from administrative perspective, I don't see Syria can be divided, because there's no way to divide Syria when we talk about only the economic resources. Let's say today what they call it regime control area from Latakia down to Dar'am, they don't have any resources, 0 resources. They have majority of people living there, that's true, but all the raw materials like gas, oil, water, cotton, agriculture is the other side of Syria. I don't know how this can be divided. I think we will go more about decentralized Syria. I think this will fit short-term the people who feel they cannot go alongside with other people. Like the Alawite, they don't feel the Sunni are a good component for them now. Let's say decentralized Syria. Are we going there? I don't see there. I think the Russian, Iranian, they through Astana process, they want to impose that the regime is when we should put the final game, the Syria, how it looks like, according to their own interest. I think the United States that I know the United States has spent a lot of money on Syria. What we need from the United States and the regional countries and the international community to have political will to go forward rather than military will, which already exists, or financial will, which already exists.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kimmich, my good friend and military assistant, John Taft here, was instrumental in enabling a Mideast broadcasting company miniseries called The Black Crows. I don't know if some of you may have seen it. It aired on NBC earlier this year during Ramadan, and it's been picked up for Netflix, by Netflix for worldwide distribution. So with regards to US government efforts to synchronize, what do you assess? Let me just add also, we've been outmaneuvered a lot on the battlefield in the information battlefield by a very nimble, aggressive adversary. And I think often we have a lot of restrictions. So what do you assess to be the critical steps that US government and partner nations need to take to leverage our considerable resources and make meaningful improvements in our current approach?
Sure. I think that the single biggest factor is having a sense of what we and others are doing. You know, the U.S. government is enormous. It's very hard. It's not even finding what the right hand and the left hand is doing. It's finding what all of the various tentacles are doing and then coordinating that with our partners. Some of that is in the area of content. It can be television series. It can be any form of content. Some of it is going to have to take the form of, I think, intellectual content. One of the areas where I think we have really let the adversary lead is in the intellectual area. Not the stuff that the 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds read, but what the leadership cadres read. If you look online, there are very comprehensive libraries in Arabic that cover all aspects of doctrine, of theology, and we are not, as the U.S. government, in a position to match that, but some of our allies are, and some of the expertise in the region is there. So I think that, broadly speaking, we have the capabilities, we certainly have the resources, we have the expertise. It's really a question of pulling that together. I'll note in this context one initiative that we're pursuing, which is there are messaging centers in a number of countries that are working on the counter-ISIS fight. The best known of these centers are the Sawab Center in the United Arab Emirates and the recently created Ittidal Center in Saudi Arabia, but there are others as well. And we're working on a project to assess the state of these centers and bring them together into more of a whole that can work together. And there are going to be regional differences, there are going to be different approaches, there are going to be projects and campaigns where it doesn't make sense for everyone to work together, but there will be larger overarching, I would say, strategic themes that will make sense for everyone to work together. And we're encouraged by the initial receptivity of these centers, and we think that we are starting to make progress in this area.
Great, thank you. And last, for Admiral Bradley, the United States and its partners and allies have employed considerable military capability to prosecute multi-regional counterterrorism campaigns for at least the last 16 years. And you've had the privilege of serving at the forefront of a lot of those efforts. From your perspective, are we seeing success militarily or politically, and what lessons have you learned?
Sure. So I think it's hard to argue against military tactical and operational success on the battlefield throughout those 16 years and potentially even beyond that. And I think you'll continue to see that with this particular fight. We will be militarily, tactically, and operationally successful. The question on the broader strategic front, I think, is a bit more mixed, but I'm optimistic. And so maybe I can say a couple of words about both sides of that equation and how and then offer a thought about how it might balance out. So at the cause for optimism is, in my mind, the fact that we have wholesale taken on this idea of operating by, through, and with the local forces to affect our ends. And by ends, I mean render down the violence that these violent extremist organizations can bring to bear against the populace. As has been stated several times, that is truly the only way that we end up with a lasting success, is when the local security element, the local populace, feels like they have defeated their enemies. in reality, what's more important than how the local populace feels, it's how the enemy feels. If the enemy, if the violent extremists in that region feel that they were defeated by the United States or a coalition from external, then they only have to wait for us to leave for them to rise back up and take on the local governance again. If they feel like, and they heartily believe that they were defeated by the local governance there, then their only resort is to come back to the table to negotiate in a political construct that might allow stable and civil society to emerge again. And so that actually, I think, is the crux of what long-term strategic success looks like, is when you break the will of the extremists to the point that they feel they only have the option of negotiating. And that question is undecided. We will continue to apply U.S. and coalition violence where it's required to render down the threat, to buy down the entry of the local forces and the local governance structures to try to perform. But ultimately, whether they can perform is going to be more determined by our collective efforts to bolster them and their efforts within their own societies to bring about a change to the societal underpinnings that have caused the rise of extremism to begin with. So on the negative side of that equation, you can look to the emergence of these various factions in other places around the world to see, a negative indicator of success. And we've got to be ever present and mindful that just because the current fight is in Iraq and Syria at the moment doesn't mean it's the only place in the world where this challenge will rise and could rise. And so we've got to be mindful of that and stay partnered in a broad global coalition against what is truly an enduring threat. And by enduring, generational potentially. It's been couched in many ways, but I think that's at least a good way to think about it. So what do I think the outcome is? Well, I think the fact that we have taken on this by, with, and through methodology in such wholesale manner is an indicator of progress. It is indicative that we recognize the real roots of the problem, and that it's not long before we begin to apply that across the rest of our interagency, so that it's not just the military applying a coalition perspective. Of course, the State Department does that inherently, but that we begin to think about the problem from our financial perspectives, the economic and the communication perspective in the same sort of coalition manner. And once we are able to do that, then I think the signs are positive.
Great, thank you very much. Definitely have to take our last question. I want to say thank you to my fellow panelists for their participation and their great points.